Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a really critical spot on the map, one that's often overlooked but actually impacts our everyday lives quite directly. We're talking about the Strait of Hormuz. And our mission here, really, is to unpack why this narrow waterway is just so important, what the potential risks are surrounding it, and crucially, what those risks could actually mean for you, the listener, in, tangible ways.
Well, it really is quite something to think about. I mean, geographically speaking, it's just this narrow channel of water, only about 21 miles wide, and its narrowest point, it sits right there between Iran and Oman. But despite its size, its strategic significance is just huge. It's basically the world's most important route for oil transit.
And the numbers really make that clear, don't they? When you look at the volume,
Yeah.
we're talking about something like 20% of the world's oil, and maybe a third of all the global liquefied natural gas, LNG, passing through this one single spot.
A third.
So you might be thinking, okay, what's that got to do with me? Well, think about where that oil and gas is going. Places like India, Europe, China. Which means it almost certainly impacts the petrol you put in your car, maybe the gas you use for cooking, or even just the price of imported stuff you buy. Okay, so we've got the what and the how much, but why? Why is this, 21-mile stretch of water so critical? Is there really no other way?
Well, fundamentally, it acts as the crucial link, almost the only practical link for massive volumes of oil and gas coming out of the Middle East heading to global markets. We mentioned the stats, 20% of oil, a third of LNG. That reliance is immense. And you asked if there's another way. Well, bypassing it isn't simple. It's not just about laying some pipes. You're talking huge political challenges, massive investment, difficult terrain. Building a real alternative takes, well, potentially generations. So yeah, any closure or even a serious disruption, that would have immediate, far-reaching effects on energy supplies globally because there's just no easy substitute for that kind of volume.
Right, that really drives home how indispensable it is. And naturally, when something is that indispensable, it becomes a point of leverage, a pressure point. Which brings us to the geopolitics of it all, because Iran, for example, has threatened to close the strait more than once, hasn't it? Especially when facing pressure like sanctions from the U.S.
Absolutely. Those threats are definitely out there. And they aren't necessarily empty threats. The practical question is, how could they actually do it? How could Iran disrupt or try to close such a vital sea lane? Well, they have a few potential methods, things like deploying naval mines, which are obviously dangerous, or using missiles, or even employing what's called swarm tactics, using lots of small, fast boats to sort of overwhelm or harass larger tankers. We saw a very real example of this potential back in 2019, remember, with the seizure of that British tanker. So these aren't just abstract ideas. They've happened. They have precedent.
It's quite sobering, isn't it, that a waterway that narrow can hold so much sway over global energy. And it's not just about physically closing it off, is it? It seems like the threat of closure is almost as powerful.
Oh, definitely.
Just the possibility is enough to make oil prices jump, rattle stock markets around the world, and, potentially send your energy bills higher. It's a very effective pressure tactic.
Exactly. Because the global economy is so finely tuned to the flow of energy through that strait, any hint of disruption creates immediate jitters.
Okay, so that psychological element is huge. If even the threat causes that much trouble, let's really bring it home. What does a crisis in Hormuz mean directly for you?
Well, let's take an example our sources highlighted, like India. India imports, I think it's around 80% of its oil needs, a huge amount.
80%, wow.
Yeah. So if Hormuz gets disrupted, fuel prices in India would likely shoot up almost immediately, significantly. We're talking potentially petrol going up by maybe 10, even 20 per liter. And LPG cylinders, essential for cooking fuel for millions, those could jump by 200 or possibly more.
And that's just the direct fuel cost.
Right. Then you get the ripple effect. Higher transport costs mean everything gets more expensive. Vegetables, groceries, even getting a ride share. It hits everyday life across the board.
That kind of a sudden shock would be felt very sharply.
Very sharply.
And it's not just India, of course. You mentioned Europe earlier. Many European countries are now pretty reliant on LNG, liquefied natural gas coming from Qatar. And that gas also has to ship through Hormuz, right?
Correct. A lot of it does. So a disruption there could make those already high energy bills in Europe even worse, especially, if it happens heading into winter. That would be particularly painful.
It's like a chain reaction.
It is. And looking even wider, the economic impact spreads out. Think about airlines. Their fuel costs would skyrocket. Manufacturing could face disruptions, higher shipping costs. And if a crisis really drags on, you could start seeing bigger macroeconomic effects. maybe rising inflation, potentially job cuts if industries struggle, maybe even central banks raising interest rates. It just shows how interconnected everything is.
It really does.
Yeah.
So, okay, the stakes are incredibly high. The potential impact is immediate and widespread. Is there any way out of this? Can these risks actually be avoided or at least, mitigated effectively?
Well, the sources generally point towards two main strategies people are looking at: diplomacy and diversification. Diplomacy is obviously about trying to manage the political tensions, keep communication lines open, avoid escalation. That's ongoing, but fragile.
And diversification. What does that look like in practice?
Diversification is about reducing that dependence on Hormuz. So countries are trying to build pipelines that go around the strait, overland routes. There's also investment in renewable energy sources, trying to shift away from fossil fuels long term. Yeah. And building up strategic fuel reserves. So having stockpiles that can act as a buffer if there's a sudden supply cut.
Okay, so there are efforts being made. Building pipelines, renewables, reserves.
Yes, but it's important to have perspective here. While these efforts are happening, the sheer scale of energy flowing through Hormuz now and the existing global infrastructure built around it, well, these alternatives take a long time to build up. Diplomacy can fail, pipelines face their own challenges, renewables are a gradual transition. So these measures help, they provide some cushion, but they don't eliminate the risk overnight. It's more like patching potential leaks than rerouting the whole river, if that makes sense.
That's a really important point. And sounds like despite all these efforts, the Strait of Hormuz is likely to remain a major geopolitical flashpoint for the foreseeable future, basically as long as the world is so dependent on Gulf oil.
That seems to be the reality, yes. True energy independence from that choke point is still a very long way off for many major economies.
So wrapping this up then, the key takeaway seems to be that this geographically tiny strait, Hormuz, wields this sort of outsized power over the global economy and, in turn, over your daily life in ways you might not even think about usually.
Exactly. And understanding these critical points, these global intersections, it's really vital, isn't it? For anticipating how economies might shift, for understanding how events happening thousands of miles away can connect directly back to us.
Yeah, it really underscores that interconnectedness.
Everything's linked.
Yeah.
From that narrow waterway all the way to potentially your household budget.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Just consider, as you go about your day, how resilient is your local economy or your own household budget, or even just your daily commute? How resilient are they really to something going wrong in a narrow strip of water halfway across the world? It's quite a potent reminder, I think, of just how deeply these global supply chains really do impact our local lives.